Happy Friday, everyone. With this class, we're drawing to a close the week-long discussion on empire and the Delian League, and particularly Athens' controversial behavior towards its allies. But we're also pivoting to next week, because whether we were teaching this as a gaming class or a more traditional class, I don't think we could really walk away from Athens in 403 BCE without having a sense of how the story ends. We've spent so much of the semester on the beginning portion. What are the events that brought us to 403 BCE? But now in this kind of last week and a day, I get to open the closing chapters, to deliver the spoilers, and to tell you how classical Greece comes to a close. In some ways, it's going to be tough to do that in 30 minutes, although that's what we're going to shoot for, because we actually have a story of not one city-state, but three, as we look at what happens between 399 BCE and the 360s. For that reason, I've called today, and then there were three: Sparta, Thebes, Athens, and the end of classical Greece. And that's because the years between the death of Socrates and the rise of Macedon are characterized by power grabs, almost like musical chairs, between these three city-states, as they're all struggling and ultimately failing to unify Greece under a singular power. So that will be our goal today, to cover that. And perhaps in a strange way, we're actually not going to spend as much time on Athens as in other classes, but it will come back to my lecture at the end. All right, ready to go? Awesome. Let's start with a quick recap of what I covered on Wednesday. Last class, I kind of brought to the end a long story of Athenian exploitation. We've seen that from the years immediately after the Persian War, right up to the years of the Sicilian expedition, Athens had really alienated the rest of the Greek world because of its unfair treatment, maybe even we would say brutal treatment, of subject members of the Delian League, those who had decided that they wanted to withdraw their support, to go their own way. This treatment, of course, began with the island of Naxos, which Cimon forced to stay in the Delian League by surrounding with ships and starving them out. But last class, we also contrasted the examples of Lesbos, the city of Mytilene, who barely escaped with their lives, and Milos, the island that was summarily executed, enslaved, and recolonized by the Athenians. But of course, our game in 403 BCE happened after all of this, after all of our bullying behavior. The very first game session we played took place around 405, 404, when we were all starving and the Spartans were surrounding our city walls. And if you may remember from the Xenophon reading at that time, it was Xenophon who pointed out that when the Spartans came to destroy Athens and began to tear down its long walls and to set fire to parts of the city, the Athenians were afraid that they too were going to be killed and enslaved in the same way that they had done to so many other city-states. It's really by the grace of Lysander and Pausanias that they didn't. But I think that many city-states would have been perfectly happy to see Athens suffer the way that it had forced so many other places to suffer. So now we see how Athens comes full circle from this scrappy little city starting to fight against the Persian Empire, to itself becoming like the Persians in their bullying tactics, and then at last being subject to the same bullying tactics as other cities got the advantage over them. In the years after the Peloponnesian War, as Athens struggled to get back on its feet, as Athens put to death philosophers like Socrates, we see that Athens now came to play a smaller role in the big-scale political and international negotiations of the Greek world. In fact, the beginning of the 4th century, remember 5th century is the 400s, 4th century is the 300s, the beginning of the 4th century is actually characterized more by a struggle for power between two city-states other than Athens. And those city-states, of course, are Sparta and Thebes. I want to kind of lay out the timeline for today's lecture, which is that we're going to be looking at about the 40-year period between 403 BCE, which was the time of our game, to 362 BCE, which is characterized by an important battle. And I think that in broad strokes, we could divide these 40 years into 3 decades of Spartan hegemony, meaning Spartan leadership, Sparta in charge, and then about 1 decade of Theban hegemony. The word hegemony comes, by the way, from the Greek word hegemon, which means the leader, right? So everyone is sort of vying. Now that Athens has been put in its place, who's going to fill the power vacuum to become the new hegemon of the Greek world? And how might they go about it differently than the Athenians did? At the same time, though, we shouldn't discount the Athenians entirely. They did not just spend these 40 years licking their wounds and thinking about their mistakes. In fact, while Sparta and Thebes are sort of duking it out for position, Athens itself is doing a lot of background work. And that background work, in broad strokes, is an attempt to rebuild the Delian League. Now, we don't have a huge amount of information about how Athens went about this, and I'm certainly not going to spend a ton of time on it today. But I do think it's important to note 2 things which will recur at the end of my lecture, which is that Athens clearly never gave up hope that she as a city-state could rise again from the ashes to become the hegemon of Greece. And second of all, there's also some evidence that Athens had learned from its mistakes and was trying to do things over, to build a better, maybe even gentler Delian League than the one that came before. I know so much of our game sessions and in this class we have felt that Athens is like Charlie Brown in the football, like they never learn from their mistakes, but certainly in the 4th century we see some evidence that they knew that the tactics they'd used in the past wouldn't work this time. All right, here's how I'd like to kind of go about today's lecture before I give you my big idea. We're going to start by kind of finding out what happens to Sparta between 403 and 471. I'm going to have to leave a lot of detail out. We're just going to hit the high points. And then we're going to come back to Thebes and look at how Thebes, for about a period of 9 years, tries to make their own empire in a very different model than either the Spartans or the Athenians. Today's big idea, though, is perhaps a little bit of a bummer. Remember, the title of my lecture is not just, and then there were 3, it's also the end of classical Greece. Well, ultimately, what I'm going to argue to you for the rest of today is that classical Greece ends with infighting and a desire for individual glory rather than collective cooperation. It really is the Greeks and their infighting that kick their own butts rather than an outside force. And today I'm going to kind of show you the dominoes of how that comes to happen. All right, when you're ready, let's have a look at Sparta. Okay, from what we last remember of Spartan history, in 403 BCE, after Lysander had set up the 30 tyrants, after the 30 tyrants had been kicked out, after there was a bit of an Athenian civil war between Thrasybulus and the oligarchs, the aristocrats, we know that the Spartan king Pausanias ultimately gave Athens its freedom back. Pausanias said, look, Sparta doesn't want to be involved with Athenian political nonsense. You go your way, we'll go ours. Despite Pausanias' willingness to give the Athenians back the reins, the control over their own life, there is no doubt that the Spartans were in a really powerful position after the fall of the 30 tyrants. Remember, they had seized control of all of Athens' ships, they had torn down the Athenian defense walls, and they had liberated all of the members of the Delian League so that Athens couldn't draw any more tribute in the way that it had under Pericles. So for all intents and purposes, even though King Pausanias of Sparta decided to play Mr. Nice Guy, the Spartans basically had an open highway to do what they wished. In our reading last night, this was actually one of the first things that McInerney starts with. As Athens struggled through the civil war in the reign of the 30, Sparta was free to exploit their victory in the Peloponnesian War, but squandered this opportunity. Squandered. What does that quite mean? Well, on the one hand, we know that Sparta has all the chips, right? That we have Lysander, perhaps the most innovative Spartan commander to live since the time of Lycurgus. We know that in addition to having torn down Athens' defenses and taken their ships, Sparta has both the funding and the fleet of Persian-backed Prince Cyrus, right? So they have everything on their side. Ironically, though, it is that same Persian support that will prevent the Spartans from really expanding their power throughout the Greek world. Let me explain what I mean. I want you to think back to my early lectures on Lysander, this innovative Spartan general, not a king, but highly respected among the military. And I emphasized to you that one of the reasons that Lysander had been so successful is that he was able to forge an unusual alliance with the Persians. In particular, Lysander got along famously with a Persian prince named Cyrus the Younger. And when Lysander accepted both the money and the naval supplies from Cyrus the Younger, it was with the understanding that a certain deal was being struck. And I'm going to call this a deal with the devil. Not because I think the Persians are the devil, but just because a deal with the devil usually means a trade-off that you're really going to pay for later. And the Spartans are going to pay for that deal right about now. Around the year 402, Cyrus's father, the Persian emperor, died and was going to be replaced by Cyrus's older brother. Cyrus, however, had amassed his own support and wanted to make a bid for himself to become the Persian king. But he knew it couldn't do it alone. His older brother had far more support among the Persian bureaucracy and the Persian military. So Cyrus, who has been waiting and funding the Spartans and building up that friendship and loyalty, now knows in 402 this is the perfect time to pounce. It's time to call in that favor, kind of like the Godfather. When he needs you, that's when you have to show up. Cyrus essentially says, hey Spartans, the time has come. I am going to war with my brother for the throne of Persia. Time to send me those hoplites. I've been helping you for years. Time to return the favor. And to the credit of the Spartans, they agree. Ironically, Lysander is beginning to fade from Spartan politics around this time, but nonetheless, the Spartans promise to send Cyrus a force of 10,000 Greek mercenaries with at least 700 Spartan warriors. And because he just gets so many cool points for this, I want to alert you to the fact that the person put in charge of this mercenary Spartan force is none other than our historian Xenophon. And we know so much about what happens because Xenophon writes a whole book about this Persia expedition called the Anabasis. Now, this mission that Xenophon was leading, it's sometimes called the March of the 10,000 or the Mission of the 10,000. It was a mission unlike any other the Greeks had undertaken in the past century or even prior. According to Xenophon, their mission was to lead these 10,000 Greek warriors deep, deep into the heart of Persia. Right? We're right in the heart of Babylon. If you know anything about biblical history, you can see there Gargamel, Nineveh. We're not just on the Persian borderland. We're like deep into Persian territory. This is a road absolutely no Greek warrior would have taken on his own, right? You don't just go trouncing around Persia. It's enemy territory. But the 10,000 Greeks were welcome to enter Persia because they had the blessing of Cyrus. They were fighting under a Persian warlord, making a bid for the throne. This big 10,000 march has good news and bad news, but the bad news turns out to be worse than the good news. The good news is that when Xenophon leads these 10,000, they come to a head, but brother, Persian versus Persian, or Persian versus Greeks, in 401 BC at the Battle of Cunaxa. I'll go back to my map in just a minute to show you where that takes place. And this was the great showdown. Cyrus the Younger with his Greek forces fighting his older brother Artaxerxes II with his Persian forces. And we can see already, if you just look at the numbers, it's pretty clear that the Greeks were outnumbered, right? Probably by, let me run some quick math. Yeah, more than 2-1, right? Nonetheless, they win this battle deep, deep in Persian heartland. I'm not a military historian, but perhaps it's because the warriors deep in that Persian heartland hadn't really been experienced fighting Greek hoplites. You can see if I go back here, Cunaxa, there it is, like right in Babylonian territory, right in Mesopotamia. So the battle goes well. Xenophon celebrates a victory. The Spartans, do their war dance. But here's the bad news. Cyrus himself was killed in the battle. The guy whom they had come all this way to fight for. I might be misremembering this, but I think he's like pierced through the head or pierced through the eye and dies instantaneously. Now the Greeks have a real problem on their hand. If Cyrus had won, the Greeks would have been welcome guests, right? Welcome guests of the new Persian king. But because Artaxerxes ultimately wins, the Greeks now find themselves many hundreds of miles deep into Persian territory, and they are stranded. Their host, their sort of sponsor to be safely in Persia, is now gone. And what makes the Anabasis such a suspenseful story is if you see the red arrows, the red line leading out, this is the sort of hard scrabble way that Xenophon had to get his 10,000 Greek guys out of Persian territory. It was terrifying. They were attacked on all sides. The guy who they had come to fight for was now gone. And the Persians definitely weren't opening the welcome mat. There's no hotels to stay at for the Greeks as they just try to put their heads down and power out of Persia. If, in case you're kind of like this, I don't know, sort of dodgering story, there is a 1970s adaptation of the Anabasis called The Warriors. I'm going to take a minute and put a clip of the Warriors trailer into my video. If you're stuck at home and you're kind of bored, need to watch a cool movie, this whole great 70s gang warfare is based on Xenophon's Anabasis. That said, if you're not interested, just skip forward a couple of minutes, and we'll pick right back up with how it ends.
These are the armies of the night.
Can you dig it? Can you dig it?
The Furies. The Boppers. The Hi-Hats. The Lizzies. The Turnbull ACs. The Gramercy Riffs.
Riffs! Yeah, right!
And these are the Warriors.
We know about the Warriors. They're a heavy outfit.
They're from Coney Island.
Warriors? You guys are the big dudes, huh?
Now they're in the Bronx.
We're going back.
27 miles behind enemy lines.
It's the only choice we got.
Between them and safety stand 20,000 cops and 100,000 sworn enemies.
I want them all. I want all the warriors.
They've got one way out. They've got one chance. They've got one night. The Warriors.
Okay, Xenophon did ultimately get many of the 10,000 men out of Persia, but he lost 4,000 along the way. He was able to get to the Black Sea coastline and get the Spartans onto boats and slowly make their way back to the Peloponnese. But this was a grand mission that was devastating both to the mercenary cause and to Spartan morale. And because Sparta was so engaged fighting around in internal Persian brother warfare politics, it meant that they weren't spending those time and resources consolidating power in the Greek world. And even when they got back home and when they began to focus on more domestic issues, the Spartans also ran into the problem that they had seriously pissed off the new Persian emperor. Remember, Artaxerxes, the older brother, was still around, and he remembered that the Spartans had interfered in Persian politics. I kind of like to imagine him saying, just like Darius and Xerxes, I'm going to teach those pesky Greeks not to meddle in Persian affairs. Maybe almost like Scooby-Doo-like. And Artaxerxes harnesses his vengeance against the Spartans in order to meddle in Greek politics. Here in our textbook reading, his response was to dispatch an envoy to stir up discontent in Greece against Sparta and to negotiate an alliance of Thebes, Athens, Argos, and Corinth to fight against the Spartans. So basically, Artaxerxes sends money, sends envoys, and he goes out to everybody who has an axe to the grind with the Spartans, and he pulls them all together and he says, I hate the Spartans, how about you? And all those other Greek city-states are like, yeah, the Spartans suck. And everybody from these odd corners, I guess this warfare makes strange bedfellows, come together and they unify all of their power, Thebes and Corinth and Persia, against the Spartans, right? And this is what Sparta has to deal with for a period of about 8 years, right? 395 to 387. It's called the Corinthian War. And it's basically just everybody ganging up on Sparta year after year after year, and Sparta having to defend themselves. Now, I'm not terribly interested that you know all the intricacies of the Corinthian War. It's basically, everybody versus Sparta. But I do want you to know how it comes to an end. Around the year 371, this sort of confrontation finally comes to a quieting point, and the Greek world is right on the precipice of a nice peace treaty. The Spartans have finally quieted most of their enemies, and they declare, we're going to have a peace treaty between all of us throughout the Greek world, except one person who doesn't really agree is Thebes. This is more complicated than I'm making it out to be, but we're just going to simplify. And when Sparta tries to sort of establish this peace treaty, Thebes is not comfortable or refuses to sort of accept the fact that Sparta wants to be a regional power and Thebes cannot. And because Sparta and Thebes can't come to an agreement in a peace treaty, they go to war against each other at the famous Battle of Leuctra. Now, I personally don't think the Spartans were really too worried about the Battle of Leuctra, because if there's one thing Spartans did really well, it was land warfare, right? Hoplite warfare. And this was, not far from their own territory, close to the Peloponnese, probably thought they would have no problem. But what they weren't counting on was the badass homoerotic fighting force known as the Theban Sacred Band. This has got to be one of the greatest moments from gay news or gay history, even though the term gay and straight don't really apply in the ancient world. Let me tell you about this incredible fighting force that managed to kick Sparta's ass at the Battle of Leuctra. Thebes had an elite sort of fighting corps of 300 male lovers. And in order to be a part of the corps, you had to come in pairs. Each of the soldiers in this Theban sacred band also had a lover, a boyfriend, and a rostes within this band. And the thinking went that if you were fighting side by side with your male lover, you would fight twice as hard, because nobody wants to be embarrassed in front of the person they love, right? We all want to look our best in front of the person we love. And these 300 badass lovers were responsible for shocking Sparta and the rest of the Greek world by defeating the Spartans, even though they were almost outnumbered 2-1. The Battle of Leuctra was a sound defeat, and it was also decisive in that it was really the first time that the Spartan hoplites had been defeated near their own terrain by fellow Greeks. Sure, the Spartans had lost some battles to Athenians here and there, but this one was so bad that many of them surrendered and then had to face sort of repercussions back home in Sparta, penalties and punishments for surrendering, which was a very un-Spartan thing to do. So again, if you're into the history of homoerotic couples or gay history, the sacred band is something that we should all be celebrating. Just fascinating. Now, because of the Battle of Leuctra, and because Sparta fell so shockingly to Thebes, it completely rearranged the sort of political dynamics in the Greek world. And whereas we had just had Sparta in power, our new person in the hegemony position is now Thebes, right? Thebes comes to replace Sparta as the new power base. We're not going to spend a ton of time on Thebes because Thebes, frankly, isn't in power for terribly long. I'm going to zoom in here on this map and show you a little bit about where they controlled. Thebes was really effective at essentially picking up a few pieces of the former Athenian Delian League, right, around the Black Sea entrance. But mostly what they did was they took over the Peloponnese, the territory once controlled by the Spartans. Most famously, as I say, like a flash in the pan, the Thebans took over Messenia, the territory of the Helots. And because Sparta relied so heavily on Helots for farming, for agriculture, for domestic labor, once the Thebans were able to kind of cut off the Spartans from their Helot labor force, it completely devastated and crippled the Spartan economy and way of life. I mean, the Thebans really had a knack for figuring out like where Sparta's vulnerabilities were and exploiting them. Now, you'll notice here that the one territory that is not in the yellow at this moment is actually the green Attica area. And that's because for kind of the briefest of years, Athens and Thebes were united against Sparta. It was never a terribly comfortable alliance, but it was one that, you know, if you had kind of Athens on one of Sparta's legs and you had like a dog and you had Thebes on the other leg, Sparta could never quite get right because it was always trying to focus on two enemies at once. Much of Thebes' success in the 4th century can be credited to their own general. They too have a kind of forward-thinking Lysander-like person. And the Theban general who really made Theban hegemony possible was a warrior named Epaminondas. Boy, say that 5 times fast. Epaminondas. Not only was Epaminondas brilliant on the battlefield, he had orchestrated the victory at Leuctra, but he also had a unique model for controlling the territories under Thebes' hegemony. He had looked at the Spartan model of just kind of enslaving people, and he had looked at the Athenian model in which everybody was kind of subject to pay Athens tribute, and he decided to reject both of those and create a different one. What Epaminondas created is something that we might call federalism. And for those of you who aren't policy wonks, federalism is essentially the idea of a sort of capital government, a central government, but then localities also manage themselves. The US is a federal system, right? We have city districts, we have county districts, then we have states, and then we have the federal government sitting on top of that. And different powers are allocated to each. In our textbook reading, it points out that Epaminondas got this idea from Boeotia, his region, the region around Thebes, in which a single city exercised leadership over a much larger region, and satellite towns remained self-governing. I'm going to jump down. The decade of Theban power reinvigorated federalism as a viable model for Greek political life. Small communities, towns, and tribes favored it as a way of maintaining their identity while gaining strength in numbers. The reason Epaminondas's federalism worked for a time is that being in a federal system was way more palatable to conquered city-states than simply being enslaved like the Spartans would do, or being forced to pay tribute or die like the Athenians had. Right? I might not love Theban power, but if I can still run my government the way I want, and my people can still vote on local issues the way they want, it allows various communities to keep their own sense of identity and independence, even while they recognize the larger power of a federal state like Thebes. Why was Thebes' reign so short-lived? Well, it comes down to what I kind of like to call the hegemony hot seat. And what we're seeing in the 4th century is that individual loyalties kind of come apart as each of these city-states squabbles over who's in the power position, right? When Sparta's there, it's like a dangerous love triangle, or I don't know, hate triangle. When Sparta's in the hot seat, then Athens and Thebes team up. When Thebes is in the hot seat, Sparta and Athens team up. Athens never really got in the hot seat again, but when they were at their height of their power, Thebes and Sparta teamed up, right? It's like anybody can only stay in the hot seat for so long before the other two will get pissed off and try to take them down. By the time we get to the 370s and 360s, it becomes clear that Sparta and Athens, who had previously been enemies during the Peloponnesian War, now team up in order to take down Thebes. And this effort to yank Epaminondas off the hot seat culminates at the last battle that I want to talk about today, and that is the Battle of Mantinea, or as I'm having fun with, the one last blow it out your ass battle. This one was rough. Mantinea is kind of triangulated right between Sparta and Athens and Thebes, and it was devastating. It was basically like the kitchen sink. Thebes and Arcadia and all of the other Boeotian city-states against Sparta and Athens and Elis and a few more villages thrown in. It's just kind of like when I think of it, kind of like a bar fight, like everybody just throwing punches here in 362. And it's kind of like Thebes and all their friends against everybody who hates Thebes. Who was the victor of this battle? I like to refer to it as a circular firing squad. It's like nobody really wins. Everybody loses. If we want to get super technical, Epaminondas with his sacred band of those 300 lover warriors technically won. They technically defeated the Spartans and the Athenians. The downside, though, is that Epaminondas died in this battle himself, and he was the visionary that Thebes depended on. Without him, all of the sort of Theban power kind of fell to the wayside. And because all of these Greek city-states had entered into this circular firing squad, they made themselves incredibly vulnerable to a person I'm going to introduce you to next week, and that is Philip of Macedon. As the Greek city-states squabbled amongst themselves, they didn't pay attention to a looming threat on the horizon, the frenemy territory of Macedon. In the height of Periclean Athens, Macedon had been a relatively weak kingdom. But now that the Greek world was tearing itself apart, the Macedonians were watching and waiting for their perfect moment to take advantage of all the now weakened, vulnerable, and financially devastated city-states to the south. I'm about done for today, but I do want to close briefly by turning back to those Athenians and the effort to rebuild a Delian League. As I mentioned, as all this fighting between Sparta and Thebes is going on, Athens really is, for about a 20-year period, trying to work in the background to slowly build up a Delian League for themselves. In our textbook reading, it actually suggests that Athens made an effort to try to rebrand themselves, to try to create a new paradigm for a Delian League. The textbook doesn't say rebrand. That's my word, but that's how I like to imagine it. Gone is the Delian League in 377, and instead, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to the Athenian Alliance. Friendlier, no executions. In our textbook reading, it shows you, I'm going to dive into the middle of the passage in a minute, that the Athenians tried to recreate the Delian League by taking away all the things that everyone had hated about it before. There were to be a bunch of guarantees. No garrisons, i.e. stationing of soldiers, no tribute, no political interference, and Athenians could no longer own property or take tribute or any kind of financial benefit from the new members of the Athenian alliance. And in so doing, they were actually pretty successful. Let me jump you up back to this map again. Don't get seasick here. You see all those territories in green? Those are the territories who, from 371 to 362, Athens managed to get back into their newly rebranded Athenian alliance. And for a while, it probably looked to the Athenians as if they had a decent shot to try again, to learn from their mistakes. Unfortunately, and this is where I'm going to end today, Athens, much like Sparta, much like Thebes, spent more time and effort on trying to destroy its great enemies than thinking of a plan for cooperation and collaboration. And for this reason, despite their efforts, neither the Athenian alliance nor really any other hegemony in the Greek world could put aside their fight for supreme power and work together. How did the classical world end? How did classical Greece collapse? It really came from them kicking their own butts. All right, next week, Macedonians, Philip the One-Eyed and Alexander the Great take advantage of Athens in a moment of weakness. See you later.